I'm going to hand over in a minute to tonight's speaker. This is Graham Lyons, and he's going to talk to us about how knowing your plants can facilitate recording of other species groups. And then after he's spoken to us for about 40 minutes or so, then he'll stay on. He'll be available to answer your questions because we're here until 8 o'clock. So, Graham, I'm going to embarrass him now. He's amazing. He's the ideal person to talk to us about this subject. He is one of those mythical people known as panlisters who seem able to record just about everything: plants, birds, invertebrates, the lot. He's got an amazing website, which he'll be telling you about, and he's got a new book out all about panlisting. So we'll be able to share links to both of those soon. And I would just want to flag to you, for those of you who are BSBI members, you can currently claim a lovely 25% discount if you want to order a copy of Graham's book, although it would still be worth it even if you paid the full price for it. So, Graham, I think we'll hand over to you now, and you can tell us all about how getting to know your plants can facilitate recording of other species. Over to Graham.
Thanks for having me. Right, I'm going to try and share this and see if it works. How's that looking?
That looks good. I can see it in big, and I
Excellent. All
can
right.
also
Well,
see a little thing of you as well. So
we'll start then. We'll start. So, okay, we've heard the name of this talk several times. For anybody who doesn't know what that is from the front view there, it's actually a purple emperor larvae. I use that as as a good way of explaining a lot of my stuff comes from a slightly different angle. Um, I'm a bit I'm a bit of a curveball when it comes to natural history. Um, so yeah, where are we going to start then? There we go. Look, when I'm about 8 or 9 years old with an owl on my arm, I've been a mad, passionate naturalist since as long as I can remember. Um, I really don't remember a time when I wasn't recording wildlife. Um, I started recording wildlife about 15 years before I heard the term biological recording. I instinctively knew I needed to be doing it, and my kind of route went started with birds, as you can see, and then it went on to plants, and then it went on to moths, and then it went on to pretty much everything soon after that. But the plant stuff's really important here. I had a teacher who was he sort of took me out birding, and then he gave me an old copy of Fitter Fitter and Blamey, and it absolutely blew my mind. I loved it because things that I've been trampling on my whole life in my garden, my whole 8 year old life, I suddenly had a key to figuring out what they were, and that was like, the keys to the secrets of the universe for me. Even though we're only talking about like common cat's ear and procumbent pearlwort and uh, time leaf speedwell, this was really magic for me. And a really important part of this is I spent the time doing it, keying things out, identifying, picture matching. I've never used and I will never use AI. Okay, I won't bang on about that, but it's not for me. And I advise people if they want to cement a long-lasting knowledge base, then I would avoid it like the plague. So fast forward um, many years, 40 years. I'm now 48. I've spent 25 years working in the natural history world via 4 years studying astrophysics. Um, don't ask. I I did 20 years with the wildlife conservation charities, 7 with the RSPB, 12 with the Sussex Wildlife Trust, and overlapping with that, I've been freelancing for crikey nearly 18 years now, 17 years. But fully freelancing for 6 or 7 years. And almost all of what I do, I'd say 85% of what I do is entomology and a little bit of, I've got one plant survey this year and then a few surveys where I try and do everything all at once. But it's really, really, really important to say how knowing your botany um, is the kind of bedrock for almost all other taxonomic groups, especially if you want to get into entomology. And I think it's just such an important thing to do. Um, I'm going to just touch briefly on this whole concept of pan-species listing. This is a new logo for our shiny new website. You see our new URL there. You won't go wrong with that. It's a completely free website, and the reason I'm mentioning this really early on is it's just well, I can tell you what pan-species listing is, right? So birders keep a list of all the birds they've seen, um, such as this killdeer here, which I saw a couple of weeks back. Uh, we decided, why don't we try? This was about 17, 18 years ago, bunch, maybe not that long ago, 16, 17 years ago. A bunch of us, small number of like-minded, crazy naturalists decided, what would it be like if we kept a list of everything, not just birds, but every moth, beetle, butterfly, lichen, sea slug, cnidarian, etc., 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 and took it to its extreme level. And before we knew it, we'd created our own hobby. And when I look back on this, um, it's um, it's very obvious in in researching my book. It's very obvious that I I am and always have been autistic and ADHD, and I didn't realize it until I was halfway through my book. As part of my research, and I've kind of fed back into the book quite a lot of stuff about all of that, dopamine and everything, because it's all and many naturalists it's wrapped up in that I think much more significant than we'd ever realized. I think I wouldn't be surprised if the majority of most of the more extreme naturalists I know are neurodivergent, and you could probably say that about most naturalists. Anyway, so we created our own hobby. We've got our own website, and now loads of people are doing it. And I've written a book about it with this fantastic cover by Rachel Hudson. I'll come back to this at the end. And there's me very excited because it came a month earlier than I was expecting. And that's how many species I've seen. 9,877. I'm in second place on the rankings, and I'm at some point in the second half of this year, I expect to reach the mythical 10,000 species. But the reason I'm mentioning this, because of those 9,877 species I've seen, 1,523 of them are vascular plants, but 6,571 of them are invertebrates. There's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of plants out there, but boy, are there even more invertebrates, and a lot of them eat plants. So I'm going to show you the next slide will be all the different things. I say all, there's just a few that I've written down hastily, things that use plants. And remember, it's not all of these groups. It's always a proportion because within all these groups, you've got a wide range of different approaches, from detritivore to predator, carnivore, et cetera, et cetera. But significant numbers of beetles, bugs, moths, all the moths, pretty much, all the butterflies and sawflies, a few flies, bees, things that form galls, things that create mines in leaves, fungi, rust, smuts, powdery mildews, and even a few spiders are kind of specific to particular plants, although they don't eat the actual plants themselves, and many more. That's just a quick list. So, as I'm an entomologist, I've lent very heavily on this talk from my blog, the Lion's Share. Check it out, and which I've been writing for like 16 years now. But I've just mined it for photographs, relevant photos, and it was quite a surprise to me to discover that I have very few photographs of the sort of plant pathogens and galls and mines, but lots of photos of nice invertebrates that eat plants. So I'm afraid it's a bit more heavily skewed that way. So I'm going to start with the invertebrates. And I'm making this rather bold claim that you can't become an entomologist until you've become a botanist. Just thinking about this long-tailed blue here, you know, they're specifically feeding on everlasting peas, and you'd be lucky to find one of these without knowing what the plant is on, what plant the species is on, and that can be said for pretty much any phytophagous species of insect, herbivorous, effectively that means. As I walk around all day as an entomologist, trying to record as many species as I can, the most species I've recorded field identified in a day was I just topped 300 last year, um, for the first time. And there is no way I could get that a list that high unless I knew, you know, oh look over here, there's a patch of rest harrow. I'm going to go and hit that with a vacuum sampler, and there's half a dozen bugs and maybe a plume moth that I might get on that. And then I go over here and sweep net a whole load of common fleabane because there's a couple of nice moths on it, another plume moth bizarrely, and a couple of tortoise beetles. And then I'm going to go over and beat that oak because it'll be absolutely alive with different types of caterpillars, deadwood beetles, etc., etc., etc. So this kind of basically underpins everything for me. Um, and I don't even think about it anymore. So I'm just going to show a bunch of nice, shiny insects, such as Chrysomela populi, which is a really big, stonking red leaf beetle, and you can find that on aspen. I love the tiny little apionid weevils, but this is probably the best one because it's metallic purple and yeah, Pseudapnemonas limonii. It's on sea lavender and it's super rare. I've only ever seen that at one site. And yeah, so you find these patches of plant, and you know that there's a chance that you might see them. And it's always really exciting. This is pretty, Mogulonis geographicus is pretty easy to find on Viper's bugloss. Now, I put it on that flower. You don't see them sitting on the flowers like that. I typically rarely sweep a lot of these things. It's usually the vacuum sampler that pulls them up from sort of like little rosettes of the food plant. But yeah, it's some of these things are like it's like once or twice in a year, once or twice in a decade. And some of them are on pretty much every patch of food plant of some things you find, and like Ned, the nettle weevil, Nedus quadrimaculatus. It's on pretty much every patch of nettles you'll ever find. And some bugs now, Sphophosphora dalmanii, a funny little leather bug, Dalman's leather bug it's called. Gorgeous little thing, and it seems to be spreading, certainly in the southeast. You're basically looking for large patches of sheep sorrel. And again, if you get down on your hands and knees, if you like, if unlike me, you don't have a suction sampler, a leaf blower rigged up in reverse to set to suck, then you can get down on your hands and knees and pick through the rosettes. To be honest, it's just as rewarding. It's just slightly slower, and usually don't have time on my side when I'm out surveying. But these are, yeah, fantastic things, and it's definitely spreading because I think it's spreading because I saw an area of wavy hairgrass, acid grassland, a few years ago get wiped out in a heat wave, and the sheep sorrel came in behind it, and then within a couple of months, this bug had moved in new to the site. So I imagine climate change is probably on this thing's side, which is why many, many, many invertebrates are expanding their range and frequency due to climate change. And then moths, things like the dingy white plume, Merrifieldia, beautiful plume moth, and there it is sitting on the food plant marjoram. Now I'm talking about the food plant here, but these are things that are eating the foliage. They're not things that are specifically feeding on the flowers. And this little hopper, the pondweed leafhopper, again, another thing that's spreading. The pondweeds that float on the surface, Potamogetons like this, common pondweed. Sorry, broadleaf pondweed. Um, Once this species was super rare, and I think it was only known from like 10 ponds. But it's highly distinctive for a hopper because there aren't really any other blue ones, and there's certainly no blue ones that sit on no other blue ones that sit on pondweeds like this. And I'll never forget a friend of mine. We went to a series of ponds, and he'd spotted this huge patch of broadleaf pondweed in this pond, and jokingly said, "Oh, look at all those pondweed leafhoppers." And I rushed over to see them, and there wasn't any there. He was joking. But I went back a month later, and it turned out there were hundreds of them there. So if he'd only looked a bit harder, he might have actually found one rather than making a joke about it. And here we've got Permastoma fastuosa, which is a amazing looking tortoise beetle. Anyone like Star Wars? I always think this looks like Darth Maul. This is on common fleabane, and bizarrely, it will also take ploughman spikenard on the downs. But I've only ever seen it on that once. Usually, it's on fleabane, and it's another thing that's spreading. Um, but yeah, what a wicked looking thing that is. And then we've got a little mirrored bug that feeds on specifically on Dyer's greenweed, Heterocordylus geniste. And if you've got a few decent plants of that, you'll tend to have large numbers of the bug. I'll come to a little point about that in a minute. And it works the other way too. So when I was on the Isle of Wight last year, um, I was yeah kicked up. I was looking for praying mantis that are suddenly breeding up there. Would you believe it? And I kicked up this moth, and I thought, oh, is that the one that feeds on? Is that the Anania that feeds on wood sage? And I thought, well, let's just look around because you don't normally see this thing unless there's significant amounts of wood sage about. And I looked around, and yeah, in the other direction to where I was searching for the mantises was a huge patch of wood sage. And yeah, it's a useful tip to helping you remember what you're looking at, not just about searching for specific things, but also I suppose the way to explain it for me is it might seem a little bit overwhelming to think that, not only are we talking about recording plants, but now you're thinking about recording all these other things. And not only are you thinking about recording these other things, you've got to connect the dots between, what that moth is and what plant it's feeding on. But to me, that is the reinforced concrete in my brain that holds it all together. The and some people sort of scoff at this when I say it, but I genuinely believe that the more knowledge I can sort of acquire and learn like that, the easier it gets because it sort of supports everything, it holds it all together. And one of my favorite things is just learning what each of these different insects does. It really does help. Um, Here's an example of our three forester moths, which are all, without looking at the antennae in detail, they are all very similar, but they all feed on different plants. And the great thing about that is, if you know where you are and you know your site well, you can pretty much eliminate the impossible. The easiest one to kick out of those three is common rock rose because the other two plants will grow, away from the chalk and the limestone, but that won't. And if you're not in that sort of habitat, then you're not going to have sisters forester. And I find this sort of thing really useful. I mean, scarce forester, if you've got a male, is easy to do because of its antennae is strikingly different to the others. But to be fair, scarce forester, even though it's on knapweed, I've never seen it away from chalk downland, whereas the one species I see only sometimes on chalk downland, but usually away from chalk downland is the forester because it's feeding on common sorrel. And yeah, on really pristine chalk downland, I don't tend to see a huge amount of sorrel anyway. But this is a really useful way of knowing if you can read the landscape as well as know your botany, it can help cement all these things together. Now, I can remember years ago, before I'd kind of figured this out when I was much younger, just being utterly bewildered by forester moths and thinking, no, especially when you find a female where there's no antennae to go on, just thinking that there's nothing I can do with this. But the reality is actually a lot more simple. It does get a bit more confusing when you get all three on one site, but we can't have it all our own way. And an even easier way is if you find the actual larvae feeding on an actual food plant. So there is a Sisters Forester grub feeding on common rock rose leaves. So I thought it'd be worth mentioning a bit about specialist versus generalist. So obviously there are loads of generalists that'll eat lots of different plants. You read about moths and it'll say or feeds on trees, or feeds on a range of broadleaf trees, or feeds on a range of herbaceous plants. But then there are some species that will only feed on one specific species, or more often, they'll feed on one specific family of species, and that's still a specialism. But that could be a huge family, so it could just be something that feeds on legumes, the pea family. So it doesn't necessarily mean that by being a specialist you're automatically rare. You can be, but more often than not, you've just restricted it to a smaller subset. So take for example the dot book. This is still a specialist, but it's extremely common. Um, Whereas this is Camphophorus impressus, and I think this is the most ridiculous level of specialism when you think about how relatively few shield bugs we have in Britain. It's really not that many. We're talking less than 100, and there's more than enough plants for them to go around. So why on earth has this little fella decided that it's going to specialize only in feeding on bastard toadflax? Now, bastard toadflax is a tiny, tiny little plant of chalk downland that's scarce even on the downs. It's certainly in Sussex. You're lucky. It's nowhere near on every patch of chalk grassland, and even then, it makes up a tiny amount of the biomass. But more often than not, if you can find that food plant, you'll find the little bastard toadflax bug, which is clearly very, very good at finding food. But I guess that's its only job, so it better be good at it. Um, this is probably the most important bit of info I could give you on this. Is if you're looking for an insect that only feeds on one plant or one family of plants, then like just don't spend if you find one plant of something, don't spend a lot of time looking for it because it's probably not going to be there. But if you hit like this bank full of common stalkspill, this is the sort of thing where I'm like, oh right, because there's loads of common stalkspill specialists and things that we like will share between geraniums and as well, and many of them are scarce. And if I see something like that, I'm immediately going to spend hours vacuuming it or sweeping it or picking through the rosettes to see what I can find. So that is definitely a very useful tip. Um, Such as a few times I've found this rare sundew plume, Buckleria pallidum, which feeds only on sundews, which is remarkable to think that these carnivorous plants that have evolved to eat invertebrates are now in a position to be eaten themselves by a tiny little larvae that eats the underside of the leaves and turns into this tiny, tiny little feathery moth. Um, so, if you find one sundew in a bog, don't bother looking for it. If you find 100 sundews in a patch the size of a couple of Ford Transit vans, then I would start looking for them off, given it the right time of year. Um, and that's kind of what happened to me at a site I was working on in Hampshire, where there was this huge patch of common fleabane. We don't really get Cassida Maria massively in Sussex. We get the one I showed you earlier, Polemostoma, the red one, which can be green, confusingly. Cassida Maria is spreading east, but it's mainly been a West Country thing, sort of western half of the UK. It is just coming into West Sussex, but I've never found it oh no, that's not true. Sorry, I have. I found it at Butcherlands a couple of years ago. Yes. Anyway, it's just coming into the county. But the first time I saw it, bear in mind I'd never seen it before. I did one big sweep of this patch of common fleabane, and I think I had 30 animals in one sweep net, and I was utterly blown away by that. But basically, if you want to find things that eat specific things, look for big stands of the food plant, and it'll pay off more often than not. And I got that free with my 30 Cassida Maria. Barracinalis is one of the rarest weevils in the country, which also feeds on common fleabane. Um, a funny little quirk. But just because it eats something common doesn't mean it's going to be common. such as the unpronounceable Trichocerocalis troglodytes, which is a thistle feeder. I've probably got half a dozen records of this spiky little weevil, and Camophila eniana, which is this beautiful orange moth with like almost just like bubbling tar on its wings, this little tortrix. I think I've got less than five records of that, and that feeds on common ragwort. So just because you feed on something common doesn't mean you are necessarily going to be common as well. More often than not, it does, to be fair, but not always. And it's kind of weird as to think what's going on. It's probably something to do with growth form, or it could just be accessibility. There's something going on that's just not. It just doesn't stack up with some of these things. But it is what it is. Right now, I come and talk about goals for a little while. I've yeah. So galls are formed on vascular plants when an insect or an invertebrate, in the case of mites like this one, Assyria, um, will lay its eggs in the plant, and the plant will respond to chemicals associated with the animal, like an enzyme, I think. Anyway, that produces a strange hard lump or twisted leaf or some sort of a profusion. There's like the cotton wool gall, which is a spectacular thing on oak. I wish I got some more photos, really, to show some of these things. But galls on oaks at the moment are particularly prolific. Oak apples are out. I saw cotton wool gall a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, and then you've got galls on the actual the oak flowers. Then later on, you'll have galls on the leaves. There's a number of really quite common galls on the leaves, but there's loads and loads and loads of galls just on oak. Um, and most plants will have some associate of this kind. And another way to look for them is find big stands. If there's one plant or one tree, it's unlikely to have been found by the relevant invertebrate. But if you've got lots of it, that's where you're going to find the galls. And then mites are one of the biggest causes, but then flies quite significant as well, like Dasyura urticae on nettle. And another mite here, which is one of the few pictures I could find on my blog, which is actually, it turns out this is a really rare gall, which basically turns the developing flower heads of small scabious into this crazy kind of like snow white dense covering of hairs. What's interesting about a lot of these things, to leaf miners, is they are way easier to identify from their galls than they are the animals themselves. And in fact, if you pick that open and pulled out one of those tiny mites, you wouldn't get anywhere trying to identify that species anyway. So these things are actually a lot easier to identify as a gall. Coming back to it, nectivores here. So most species will just take pollen and nectar from whatever flower they can access it from. So some of the longer tongue bees are going to be targeting things with a long calyx tube, like legumes, pea flowers, or the dead nettles, the labiates. Um, Whereas most things that aren't in a position to do that are just going to take what they can. But then there are some things that seem to be tied to particular plant species. This longhorn moth, Nemophora metallica, seems to. I've never seen it anywhere else other than sitting on the heads of large scabious. This is just a scabious love fest here. And bizarrely as well, there's this term oligolectic, which is you're taking your pollen only from one or a very limited number of plants. And in the case of really the genus Andrena is amongst the most wonderful genera of any British organisms, and Andrenas are just absolutely mind-blowingly cool. This is a really big one. It can either be black and red or all black. But when you see them laden with these sort of pinky purple pollen baskets, because it will only take almost exclusively takes it from large scabious, but I think they do large knapweed as well. But I've only ever seen them on large scabious. That's just Andrina hattorfiana, and it has a smaller cousin which tends to take Andrina marginata with white pollen baskets, slightly off white, because it's pretty much only targeting uh, small scabious. Although there is a incredibly dull version of this, the same species, which seems to take pollen from devil's bit scabious. So yeah, just another angle, and a random slide here. There's me on a training course about 10 years ago with Stephen Falk, and we cut these when I worked at the Wildlife Trust. We cut these lines through the scrub, these sort of wideish rides. And in the first couple of years, the response to the ground flora was just incredible, particularly in the early spring where you just have this carpet of ground ivy. And ground ivy is one of the best spring nectar sources. So many things will use it if it's in a warm and sheltered place like this. And it was absolutely alive with super rare bead you get up there called Amphophora retusa, the potter flower bee. Um, just to talk about a bit about some brilliant nectar sources. So know your plants and you know what flowers work really well. It's hawthorn. Depending on where you are at the moment, it's kind of peak hawthorn. It might have even peaked in Sussex, the hawthorn. Um, Go up to some hawthorn, check it out with the naked eye, or as I do, whack it into a tray with a big stick and see what comes out. You won't be disappointed. And similarly with oak flowers, they can be incredibly good with so many different things feeding on them. And of course, you get the double whammy with this in that you're getting all the stuff that feeds on the foliage as well. So it just all comes off into the tray for you to identify as an entomologist. It's fantastic. Field maple's really good. A bit later on, dogwood. Um, Hemlock water droplet is just starting to come out. That's what's featured here. I out of the umbellifers, by a country mile, I would say hemlock water droplet is the best. I'd say you get more stuff on hogweed later in the year. However, the best time for entomology is sort of end of May, start of June. Although that window seems to be sliding forward. I'd say it's probably going to end this year, be like last year, which would be mid-May to end of May. But that super peak period where all of the really nice things are out, like the soldier beetles and the longhorn beetles, it's pretty much lined up perfectly with hemlock water droplet flowering. So that's a really, really great tip. Is people always moaning about it being a really toxic thing. It's like, well, yeah, it's just an amazing. It's a wild plant. It's amazing, and it's amazing for invertebrates. And and these are the things that some disappointing nectar sources. You get very little on elder. You get very little on cow parsley compared to other umbellifers, and you get very little on horse chestnut. So this is a bit of a different angle that it's not all it's not spread out equally out there. And this photograph was only taken yesterday. Um, when I had an hour spare and I went and beat some oaks and some hawthorns. This was one tap of a hawthorn at Nep. And so top to bottom there, look, we've got mottled umber. Then you've got two greenish common Quaker larvae sandwiched between two figure of eights. Then you've got a sort of bluish grey. The big guy there is a sprawler. And then tucked away in the bottom there is a pale brindle beauty larvae. Now, one thing you might notice about all of them is if you're a moffer, they're all pretty much winter active or spring active, or they're things that are act adult early in the year. And I guess it's just to do with timing. I don't really know why this is the case, but at the moment, if you go and hit trees, the caterpillars that come off, and bear in mind that these are the caterpillars that will be feeding most birds. The commonest one by far is at the moment is the winter moth. It isn't. I haven't featured it there, but these are going to be insanely abundant and are feeding. Let's say they're feeding the birds, but they're none of them are adult in the summer months. They're all these winter active woodlandy sort of moths. Just a bit of an aside there. But all of these trees are particularly good, and many more particularly good for a wide range of different invertebrates. But yeah, if you've got an oak with low branches near you, before the leaves go that dark green color and get covered with the tannins and stuff and become less palatable, i.e., in the next 2 weeks, go out and have a look. Get a beating stick and a bit in a tray, or you can use an old umbrella. It's fascinating what you'll see. Um, and that was the thing I had last week. I actually I was just saying earlier, I went to do a vegetation survey and soon discovered that it was so dry that a lot of the early plants had already kind of gone over. I felt like a bit frustrated to have missed out on the mouse ears and some of the clovers. And to be fair, they might bounce back with a bit of rain. But anyway, I was distracted by all these wonderful oaks. And I think the third tree I looked at had this amazing lichen mimic came off the oak. So this again, it's not feeding on the lichens; it's feeding on oak foliage. But yeah, this is one of few moths in Britain that I have never seen the adult of. I've now seen three larvae in Sussex in the last 3 years, but this was by far the most spectacular one, like Crimson Underwing. Um, yeah, and you don't get as much on beech and hornbeam and elder. They're never the sort of things that yield many interesting things when you're hitting them. Um, Aspect and shelter really matter as well. Um, and it's not just about what type of plant it is, but if you've got a plant in a warm, sheltered kind of field corner, it's going to have a lot more on it than something that's sticking right out into the sea or over a cliff or in it's blowing a gale. A lot of the things that feed on these things are 2 or 3 millimeters long. So they don't want to get blown away. Um, so think about that sort of thing. But this is also an interesting point: growth form. So you know some invertebrates will only feed on, like, say, dead oak leaves or something like that. Some species, particularly like drought stressed or uh, plants that are kind of struggling for some reason, and then the plants can't secrete their own defense mechanism, so they're weakened, and then um, another example is like young birch is often much more palatable to a range of different things than much taller birch. And then sometimes it can be structural as well. Like whenever I see gorse when I'm out on a survey, I think, well, I have to go and give it a cursory couple of whacks into the tray because there's straight away there's like half a dozen things that feed on the gorse that are common and ubiquitous. But then more often than not, there's loads of other stuff that's just gone in there for shelter, and that's typically going to be a much more obvious in a dense clump of gorse, particularly when I can get my tray under. That's usually pretty useful as well. But big, dense, bulbous sort of gorse bushes full of dead leaves are much better than the ones that are just all leggy and spindly. So all these things sort of matter. Um, this is a really rare weevil, Aphelcus verrucatus. It only feeds on yellowhorn poppy. Now, a lot of yellowhorn poppy, when it's just getting going, is there's not much to it. But plants that are several years old and have got a lot of dead leaves at the base that build up over time. Actually, that sort of like decomposing kind of organic matter at the base of the plants gives some sort of protection, shelter, and has some sort of three-dimensional structure to it. And actually, I found that a whole range of things will get in there, particularly this. And yeah, I found 10 on one or two plants like that. But also some of the rare shingle specialist jumping spiders get into those sort of places. So it's just, as much about sort of plants as architecture as it is about what they're actually made of. Um, and some things that used to be rare are doing really well out of alien plants. So the juniper shieldbug, juniper's struggling in the south, not so much up north, but it's struggling in the south. However, it doesn't matter anymore because the juniper shieldbug, like many things that feed on juniper, will also take uh, leylandii. So this thing is now common as muck, to be honest. It's not a rare invertebrate. And again, Toadflax brocade used to be a RDB species, but it will use purple toadflax much more than it will on native toadflaxes, and as a result, again, it's no longer really scarce. Yeah, don't just think about leaves and flowers and stems. We've got miners as well. But the leaf miners don't necessarily always feed in the leaves. So hit this one, this tiny little uh, micro Tania Louisiana will mine the keys of field maple, which is just bonkers. Yeah, so leaf mines, I'll just touch on them briefly. Lots of different types and lots of different things mine leaves. The main two culprits being flies and moths. I haven't got any pictures of moth mines, but um, you want to be looking at things like there's some really good useful websites which I'll touch on briefly. Where the key, where the egg is laid? Is it on the underside? Is it on the surface? Is there frass inside the leaf? Is it linear? Is it scattered? Does it change shape? What's the shape of the mine? And there's some really useful online keys that will help you identify these things. But of course, the main thing is what species is it? So something like this Phytomyza hellebori is the only thing that mines the leaves of helleborine. So that's quite useful if you find a mine on helleborine. And I mentioned, I've sort of put this in the wrong place, really. Plants as structure. So this is a really useful thing. The greater tussock sedge. These plants can live for a very, very long time, lifting up like skyscrapers and having this kind of like this. I always think each of one of these is like a city full of invertebrates. And yeah, you'll have a few sedge feeding specialists in there, but to be honest, it'll be absolutely live with things that aren't necessarily feeding on the sedge, but are there because of the environment, such as spiders like Pteranodon setosus. And so they'll be full of spiders, full of bugs, full of beetles, absolutely magic. And another thing so Hyptiotes paradoxus, this wonderful spider. It tends to favour dense yew forest or big yews in a scattered sort of woodland mosaic. And yeah, again, you really need to know. You need to know what the plant is that you're looking at to find the invertebrates in the first place. Now, I'm just going to whiz through plant pathogens at the end of this. And say I didn't have as many things to talk slides to kind of talk about here, but seriously, that is what that fungus is called. This is hairy nuts disco. Um, this little ascomycete, this little cup fungi will grow on. Tend to see it in the autumn on the sort of well rotted down previous year's sweet chestnut husks. It's that specific. Yeah, so I tell you, whoever named that needs a prize because it's just it's such a brilliant name. Um, and then I was shown this incredible sort of like triangular thing on the Isle of Wight, Cocomyces delta, which is this bizarre kind of fungus that grows on old bay leaves. But then, of course, I haven't got so many pictures here. So we've got an alder tongue. These are bright red when the older catkins are out in the summer. I found them a bit later on in the year, they're sort of shriveled up and dried. These incredible sort of like scarf, like billowing scarves, but they're bright red come out. And I think the thing that are probably most exciting, but I just never seem to take photos of them for some reason, is the rust fungi. And they're mostly host specific, and many of them you can get to species without going as far as high powered microscopy to look at the spores. Some of them you will have to do that with, but there are a lot that are actually really, really easy. Again, I'll come onto a website. And to some extent, the same can be said for powdery mildews as well. They're just not as exciting to look at because they all look the same. It's just like dust on leaves. But the rusts can be quite spectacular. What did I have one on the other day? I had one on violets on the downs. That was a really nice. Um, there's three. Would you believe it? There's three different species on Muscatel. One of which is really obvious because it's dark, and the other two you need to do microscopy to separate them. And then, of course, you've got lots of mycorrhizal associates on the roots of trees, such as, like, the well-known fly agaric is tied up with birch. Um, and when you're in the woods, and if you've got a particular plant fungus growing on, say it's growing underneath hazel, or it's growing underneath hornbeam, or oak, or whatever, it can really help you point you in the right direction. Bizarrely, out in the open grassland, the one plant that has loads and loads of mycorrhizal associates in short grassland is common rock rose, including a load of lactarius, the milkcaps, but boletes. It's really quite special. So yeah, just talk about a few different books. So this brilliant book, Margaret Redfern and Peter Shirley, British plant goals. This is a recently updated version. Definitely get this if you want to do plant goals. You really can't do them well without it. Absolutely love this book. Yeah, can't recommend it enough. And this, the plant parasites of Europe. This website is just phenomenal for anything from leaf mines to galls to fungi. This is definitely a place to go and have a look. And the other place to look for all your identification needs is my book. There's my talk time. I've pretty much just about made it. Right. So in this book, it's kind of like, it's part memoir. It's part kind of love letter to the world of British natural history. And there's about 200 colour photos in it. I didn't think the publisher was going to let me do that. It does look really nice. Um, and it's a kind of how-to to pan species listing. It's kind of like a guide to being a biological recorder in 21st century Britain. But the thing that, of the 400 pages, the thing that should be most useful to most people, pan species lister or not, is the 200 middle pages of it cover every single taxonomic group in Britain, and it will tell you what websites to use, what books to buy, what downloads there are, what societies to join, what Facebook groups to join, what basic equipment you'll need, etc., etc. How many species there are on the UK species inventory in that group, how easy they are relative to one another, to break into, from tiny groups like butterflies that are easy, through to things that are insanely difficult, like the fungi, which there's over 15,000 species on the UKSI. So yeah, here's the code that will give you 25% off, and I think that might be my final slide. Yeah, so I'm going to stop sharing and then take some questions.
That was brilliant, Graham. Thank you so much. There's so much information there. It's a really good thing that we're recording these. I think I'm going to need to replay and make some notes. So people have been sharing a few questions as you were speaking. Couple of people have commented on, they appreciated your comments about neurodivergence. And somebody's made a really nice comment here who says they consider themselves a free range thinker. Being neurodivergent can certainly be a gift when considering the whole, but also needing to focus on the details. I really like that. I think I would like that on a t-shirt. Um, then we've got a couple of questions. Somebody says, what's the best way to get into botanical recording as an absolute beginner? I've been using iNaturalist and I'm wondering if that's poor form. There is no poor form. I think it's what people feel comfortable with. Obviously, I'm going to jump in and say, well, the best way to get started is with the 100 Plants in 2026 challenge. But how would you respond to that question, Graham, about getting started
Well,
with
yes,
botanical recording?
I would definitely use iRecord
Hmm.
over iNaturalist. Um, and there's many different reasons, which I kind of spill. I do spell them all out in the book, but I mean, briefly, iNaturalist is kind of forcing us down a photographic route for recording. Now, that might seem like a good thing as a beginner, but the reality is, at some point, you need to stop taking photographs of every single daisy to submit a record. It's just not feasible. I mean, who's got the time to do it, and who's got the time to collate all those photographs, let alone submit them onto the onto the various websites. What's ultimately going to happen with that is you'll just submit one or two records occasionally at the start of those species, and then the number of records you'll put in of those will decline. Because we're just never going to be putting yeah. Whereas with iRecord, you can yes, you can submit photographs if you're not sure what something is, but you don't have to do it all the time. And at some point with biological recording, the way biological recording is set up, and I'm a verifier for bugs, beetles, and spiders in Sussex. For me, if I see a long list of names of species that are sensible and are really, really useful and well sort of like laid out, then I'm just going to verify them. I'm going to verify them. I don't need to see a photo. So that's my most important advice I can give anybody is don't, yes, iNaturalist is slick. It looks nice, it's fast, and it's a bit more intuitive, but it's not designed for biological recording in Britain. It's an American system. We have no control over it, and ultimately you'll be submitting photographs for all eternity. So I would go with I record over any day.
Well, I'm really glad you said that because that's what we use for the 100 Plants in 2026 challenge. So that's great. Got a couple more questions. Claire says, what advice would you give to someone who has only ever learnt the common names for things and didn't learn Latin at school?
Okay, number one, I didn't learn Latin at school, but I did learn all the names of dinosaurs when I was a kid. And I think it's really important to know that we can learn them if we want to. When it comes to plants, what I would say is most botanists might disagree with you on this. However, I have got a head full of scientific names from invertebrate groups where there are no common names. I think it is also important to say instead of saying Latin names, you should say common names because scientific
Mm.
names, sorry, because it's not just Latin. It's Latin, Greek, and all sorts of other things muddled up. But I totally take your point. Um, I use, although I do know most of the scientific names of plants, I tend to prefer to use the common names of plants because they're there. They're part of our national heritage. They're part of our natural heritage. Also, they're beautiful, many of them. I mean, corky fruited water dropwort is just brilliant, isn't it? Um, and actually, they're standardized names. There's a standardized list of names with the BSBI of common names. So I wouldn't be afraid of using them where they are common names that are widely used, such as vascular plants, butterflies, dragonflies, and our macro moths. But where it becomes problematic is say where they say the bugs or most beetles or the spiders where there aren't any widely used common names, and there's not likely to be either anytime soon. So in those cases, all I would say is just feel comfortable with them. Don't get hung up on the fact that you don't know how to pronounce them, because guess what? Nobody does.
Mm.
Nobody does. And if anyone tells you how to try and say a scientific name, just tell them to bog off, to be honest, because
Yep.
you should hear us all when we're out on a field trip. It's just all everyone's saying something completely different, but we all know what we're talking about. We write it down the same, but everyone says it totally different. So I'd say just remember that the little kids when we were all little kids, we all learned dinosaur names off by heart. We can still do it. Just don't be frightened of it. Don't be worried about someone telling you you're saying it wrong, and just jump in feet first.
I think that's always a good way just to jump in feet first. And I know when I go out botanizing with a friend who's German, she'll regularly refer to geranium rather than saying geranium. So, the thing of how you pronounce it is you kind of go, well, that's how I say it. How do you say it? I would
Well, I
stand
got a
up
friend.
for, go on.
I've got a friend who used to say, so the little ladybird, little wetland ladybird, cockadula, he called it cockadoodle.
Yeah,
I
yeah. And
loved
we
it.
had a visiting professor a while ago from Scandinavia who insisted on referring to Pinus species as Pinus, and then wondered why we were all falling around giggling. I would just jump in and say, when I used to teach botany, one example I used to give about common names was the Bermuda buttercup, which is not a buttercup and doesn't come from Bermuda, so you can't always trust a common name. And of course, they vary from place to place. I'm Scottish, so bluebells to us are what you call harebells down here. So you can't always rely on a common name. You can't always rely on a scientific name either. It's
No,
complicated.
but that's what hyphens are all about. Because Bermuda buttercup should be hyphenated to show it's not a true buttercup. I mean, I appreciate that doesn't come across in a verbal
Yep.
way, but on paper, that hyphen is really important.
There's a whole running thing in BSBI News about hyphens and capitalization of common names and another
Good.
rabbit hole to go down. But an interesting question here, which I think will appeal to you as an entomologist, and we've only got 1 minute left. Harriet says she's running a bio blitz with a local Cubs group on Friday. And she says, could you please recommend 5 invertebrates for us to look out for? We're working on an overgrown allotment site. Five
Overgrown
invertebrates to
allotment
look out for
site.
at this time of year on an overgrown
Oh, wow,
allotment.
that's an impossible task to ask
Oh,
without knowing. Without seeing it, I don't know. But just look, I mean, just take a sweep net is what I would do if it's an overgrown allotment. Take a sweep net and run it through whatever vegetation is there, and you will get loads and loads and loads of things. You'll get ladybirds, definitely. Um, soldier beetles are just starting to come out. You might see some of those. I've had malachite beetles in the last week as well. Crikey. I mean, if you've got any trees, go and give them a whack and see what falls off into a tray or a white sheet. That's particularly good if you've got hawthorns, oaks for a wide range of different moth caterpillars. And that's probably it, really. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, there's just so much out there. I've had 200 field debts in April. I've had one day where I had 199 field identifications. I've never had that much in April. These dry springs are really good for invertebrates.
okay. So that's Harriet's message to give to the cubs is to go out and beat things and sweep things, and they'll be running around screaming and having a brilliant time. And if people tell them to shut up, they can go, Graham Lyons told me to do this. So I hope they have a fabulous time. And we're now at 1 minute past 8. We've only run a minute over, so we've done pretty well. And I think we just have to thank you, Graham, for this absolutely fascinating talk this evening. Thank everyone who's attended and encourage you all to go out and buy Graham's book. And no, I'm not getting a commission on it, but it is a brilliant book. And check out Graham's website as well. And we hope to see you here next week for no, actually, it's next Tuesday rather than next, sorry, 12th of May is the final webinar in this series, and it'll be Chantal Helm talking about problem records. So I hope to see you back then. And thank you, everyone, for attending this evening. Thanks, Graham. Good night, everyone.
Brilliant. Thank you. Cheers.